Hi, I'm William Intriligator. I'm the music director and conductor of the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, and I'm here to tell you a little bit about the music that you're going to listen to and create art from. The program that we have this coming January, this music will be performed in a concert January, I believe it's 25th. It's an all-American program, and so we have some American music for you to listen to and create art inspired by. The first piece on the program is actually Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, and this was a piece written during 1942, during the time that our country was involved in World War II. And the Cincinnati Symphony, the conductor of the Cincinnati Symphony, decided to hire or commission maybe 10 or 12 different composers to write fanfares for the orchestra, and also to sort of help celebrate the fact that, well, we were in the war, and to try to make it a little easier on the people who were left behind and to support the troops. So Copland wrote this fanfare for them, and it turned out to be by far the most everlasting of the different fanfares that were written by different composers. This piece has become so popular, it's performed a lot. As you probably know, a fanfare is a short musical piece that typically involves a lot of brass, possibly percussion, possibly a full orchestra. And it usually serves as a way to get people's attention or to begin an event or concert. And that's exactly what this fanfare does. For us, it will begin our concert, it will get the audience's attention. It starts with a very loud percussion section, and it goes on with a very noble and heroic theme in the brass. The percussion comes back, and the brass instruments are introduced one at a time, going from the bright, high sound of the trumpets, 3 trumpets playing together. Then the trumpets are there again with French horns added underneath, and then later trombones and tuba. Finally, the piece puts all of the brass together in a very powerful statement. It sounds so heroic and so exciting, and I just love the fact that Copland called it the fanfare for the common man, meaning that this wasn't just describing the musical sort of heroics of the soldiers fighting the war at the time that this was written, but he felt that this somehow described something about the American spirit in everybody, and maybe not in just Americans, but for everybody, that there are heroes among all of us. It's sort of like the unwritten message, I think, in that title. Because the piece sounds heroic, and he's basically, by calling it the fanfare for the common man, he's saying this is the fanfare about everybody. Those colors of the brass instruments are so powerful, and perhaps the brass instruments themselves might inspire you in your art, because they themselves are some of the most beautiful instruments that we have. Take the French horn, for instance. And the percussion instruments involved are also quite dynamic. You have the very loud timpani drums, which at one point plays some of the melody in the fanfare for the common man, playing boom, 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 like that, several times. Then you have the bass drum and the very loud gong, a tam-tam. And just those instruments create this remarkable 4.5 minute piece. After the Copland, we will also be performing music by a living American composer. A friend of mine, actually, a young man named Michael Gilbertson, who's about 26 years old, and wrote this piece called Tragedy Tomorrow. He wrote it in 2012, so it's still fairly new. It's been performed twice before. This will be the first time it will be performed in Wyoming. And you can hear a recording of it as you create your art from one of the earlier performances of it. This piece is about 12 minutes long, and Michael's inspiration for this piece came from the music of George Gershwin and from New York in the 1920s. Specifically, 4 or 5 different pictures, photographs that he found that were taken in New York in the 1920s. And you can see these photographs. We've sent them to you through your teachers. One depicts one of the very large blimps, the Hindenburgs, that they used to travel. Before they had airplane travel, people used to sometimes travel great distances on these giant blimps. And you could see one arriving in New York City, perhaps from a faraway destination, perhaps even from Europe. And apparently it looked like as if it was going to dock at the top of the Empire State Building, which would be a fascinating concept. That inspired Michael, and so shortly after the beginning of the piece, which begins with some sort of hammer blows from the full orchestra, you have this floating ethereal sound in the violins that sort of depicts that feeling that you might be floating in a blimp high above the world, and what that must look like looking down. Then later on in the piece, there's a section that sort of is more musically geometric, and what Michael described to me was that he was inspired by some of the architecture in New York. There's another picture that we'll share with you from the 20s. It's a building called the Chrysler Building in New York City, where they have, it's a famous building, it's still around today. The top of it has this sort of triangle, these triangles, which at the time was considered an Art Deco representation of a sunburst, sort of like the way you draw a sun with, you know, bursts coming out of it. So the top of the Chrysler Building was and that picture from the 20s of it was the inspiration for that musically more geometric part that sounds like da 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 da, and it just, there's some passage work in the strings. When I say passage work, I mean repeated musical lines where it's like going da 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 da, things of that nature. Another scene in one of these old photographs of New York that inspired Michael was a scene in a sort of 1920s bar slash speakeasy type of situation, where you see people in a sort of smoke-filled room enjoying a drink in a sort of a nightclub type of section, a nightclub type of atmosphere. And so the section of the music that depicts that is the part where you suddenly hear a pair of clarinets play a sort of jazzy little riff and then go down, and then it's almost as if you've entered a nightclub in this music. And again, you can hear this in the piece. The jazziness is also, pardon me, part of the inspiration for that jazziness also came from George Gershwin. See, Gershwin was an American composer who was alive in the 20s and who's still very popular today. In fact, the next piece that I'm going to talk about is a piece of Gershwin's that we're performing and that you can create art inspired by. But Gershwin is known for perhaps his most famous piece, Rhapsody in Blue. And that was written in the 1920s, and there's something about Gershwin's music that, although it's sort of classic and timeless and still performed now, it does sort of evoke a little bit that era. And so Michael was inspired by that. So there are a couple of melodies in Michael's piece that sound like Gershwin, but they're Michael's own sort of tribute to Gershwin. They're his own melodies. So that's kind of neat, the whole concept of a musical tribute, emulating a composer that you like, and so forth. So that's a little bit about Michael's piece, and I think it's a really exciting and dynamic piece. And each of the sections of the photograph sections each come back as well and sort of get changed. Another scene that I forgot to mention was a scene of automobiles driving in New York City in the 1920s. So those old-fashioned sort of Model Ts or whatever they are, driving amongst horse-drawn carriages as well in sort of the dirty streets of New York, but with those exciting New York sort of architecture that was still there at that time, like that Flatiron building, that building that comes to sort of a triangular point, things like that. So there was a picture like that, and part of the music actually sounds sort of like traffic, if you will. There's a lot going on, and again, that's another sort of musical homage or tribute to Gershwin, because he did that similar type of thing in a piece that he wrote called An American in Paris, where you can actually literally hear taxi horns in the orchestra. So that's a little bit about Michael's piece. The third big piece that we're doing is Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F. And I've given you a little bit of an introduction about Gershwin, how he was a very successful and popular American composer who came around in the 1920s. And there are some great stories about him and his life. And he had a very tragically short life, but he was extremely successful. First he wrote songs and arranged songs, and then he tried to incorporate the use of an orchestra with his music too. So he wrote Rhapsody in Blue, I think it was 1924, he wrote it in a very short time span, and what he was able to achieve with that was sort of like a combination of the worlds of jazz and the worlds of symphony. And a lot of important people were there at the first performance of Rhapsody in Blue. It was at Carnegie Hall in New York City, and it was marketed in advance as being sort of a special experiment in music. And so important composers like Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff, who were alive then, they attended. And important conductors like Toscanini and Damrosch, other people who were important conductors of the day were there. And that's important. I mention that because one of those conductors was so impressed by Rhapsody in Blue that he almost immediately asked Gershwin to write another piano concerto-like piece, like the Rhapsody in Blue, for the next year.